Delighted to have you joining us once again for Curiosity, Not Judgment. My name is Birga.
And I'm Gary.
I like that we're, always kind of
Kind
vibing
of
with the same
matching,
shirts, and
I'm actually a little concerned about that.
yeah, every week we seem to pull it off pretty well without talking about it. I think it's all weather related. We both woke up this morning and it was cold.
It's true.
Well, we wanted to talk about a topic today that's got a wide range of implications in how you live your life, the quality of your life, and all things in between. And that subject really is sacrifice. We have a running list of potential topics, and I was reading through it before I came over here today, and there was one question that really stood out to me, and it was, what are you willing to sacrifice?
And for what?
Right. That's exactly what you said when I brought it up to you, and I
Yeah.
think that's an important first question, right? Sacrificing to what end?
Yeah, and do we, are you looking for a certain outcome, and how much of what you're sacrificing is actually going to achieve that outcome in a world where, I know for me, I always think I can control more than I really can. And then sometimes we sacrifice things for bad ends and for things that aren't going to be good outcomes. You brought up addiction. There's other things that happen that are not good outcomes that we do sacrifice things for. And so, and am I sacrificing things that are bad things for a good end or good things for a good end, right? And so I think like you can visualize a little matrix
Yep.
of outcome versus sacrifice, and is it worth it and is it not, and how do we determine that? I know for me, I sometimes beat myself up a little bit, maybe legitimately, for not sacrificing a little bit of work to get an outcome that I think, this will work out on its own. I don't need to really do anything. I've got other places to spend my time. And I think that brings up the big point is, what are we willing to sacrifice our time, our talent, and our treasures for with respect to a certain outcome? And time is the one thing that we cannot replace. It's not fungible. We only have a certain amount of time. What time are we willing to sacrifice for an outcome, as an example?
Right. I think maybe let's start on the negative side so that we can end positive,
Okay,
because I think
good.
both ends of the spectrum really need to be covered.
Sure.
But you mentioned, you can sacrifice something good for a bad outcome. You can sacrifice something bad for a good outcome. So maybe let's talk about that messy mix for a moment.
Sure.
So we live in the state of New Mexico. We've often referred to the fact that we're here in Albuquerque. We're the most major metropolitan community in the state, and we're not a very largely populous state. So I think 2.4 million all in, and we've got
Half of that.
in the
in
greater
MSA,
metro,
yeah.
greater Albuquerque area. But with a high concentration of people in a scantily populated state, we seem to get the concentration of problems here in our community. And that's a concentration of homeless, concentration of those that are facing addiction, and then a concentration of crime by default because of, more people, more crime. So as I think about addiction, and as I think about that as it ties into homelessness, it really is very front and center for me in my role. So I work in the nonprofit space, and I happen to work physically, geographically in a place where I see visually every day as I go to work the number of people on the streets, the number of people actively using, openly drug using on the streets. And I think about the story of how those people got there. And at some point, the addiction took root and took hold so strongly that they were willing to sacrifice good things to stay in a bad place.
Yeah, and this is a tough topic if you've never been addicted or and you can be addicted to food, porn, gossip. There's lots of things to be addicted to, but drugs are worse in that they seem to have worse outcomes and really kind of take over your life more. And when you think about sacrificing that, you start sacrificing your values. It's little things at first, but then you start sacrificing big things like relationships and other things, and those are pretty tough things to sacrifice.
For sure. And I don't even know how conscientious it is. I don't know that somebody at one point has this crisis moment and says, relationship with my children or addiction to this substance. I don't think it's that direct of a correlation in their minds, but by default, the choices that they made have sacrificed relationships.
Well, and this is the thing. I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to choose drugs over my children.
Right.
The problem is that certain types of addiction become so physical and mental and emotional and spiritual that they take over and start making decisions for you. And not that they are an entity in and of themselves, it's just that you can't figure out how to live without it. And when you're in a situation where you can't figure out how to live without something, well, then you start sacrificing your values. And it's a slippery slope, and it happens over time. And all of a sudden you kind of wake up one day and you have sacrificed a lot of really good things for this one thing that is no longer serving you. And let's be honest, sometimes things do serve you at first.
Sure.
If you're an alcoholic, you may have, at first it may have served you when you were a teenager or a young adult, and putting you at ease and making it easier to deal with the 5,000 voices in your head, or be comfortable in certain situations you weren't. And at that point, you could say that it actually served you. But then over time, it doesn't serve you.
Yeah.
And certainly at the end, when you've sacrificed all of these good things over here, it certainly is not serving you. But by the time you realize that, it can be too late.
Yeah. I don't want to go too deep and too dark down this path, but I would imagine that, as you're listening, you can probably think about a lot of examples of sacrificing of good for the bad. And, we see that repeatedly with some of the folks that we work with. We're in the human trafficking space. And so you can imagine there were decisions, conscientious or otherwise, that led to this series of events. And it can, as you said, go to a very, very dark place. And so, that question, as we start to contemplate maybe some of the other avenues of what am I willing to sacrifice, let's shift it from, the dark conversation around, the addiction and the unclarity of thought that leads to some of these sacrifices, and shift it to say, all right, I am now aware that there are some very bad things in my life, and I am willing to sacrifice something to eliminate the bad. So we need to start now an upward trajectory on this, on this slope. And so how do we begin to really take a critical look and say, okay, in the example of alcoholism, right? So you now realize you've got this laundry list of things that have been sacrificed. And now this moment of clarity has come to say, okay, I am now willing to sacrifice something that I once thought was so important to me in order to reclaim some of those important things that I've lost.
That's right. And so sacrificing alcohol at that point and stopping that then reverses the cycle of addiction, and your brain becomes kind of unwet, and you can actually make better decisions and easier decisions where you are saying, do I sacrifice my children for this? And you're saying, no, I will not. And so you can start that upward spiral, that victorious cycle or virtuous cycle, as opposed to the vicious cycle that you're in. And you can certainly do that. Now, there's easier ones, though, that are everyday life. And you say sacrifice. Sacrifice is something that you want or think you have to have. But you could sacrifice playing games on your phone for a better outcome of being more productive or spending more time with your children.
Absolutely.
And that, it's a sacrifice. It seems like a no-brainer when you think about it logically, but when you're sitting there with a few minutes on your hands, and you pick up your phone and you start playing a silly game, well, that is a sacrifice to not do that for a better outcome.
Well, and I'm not going to play psychologist too much here, but whenever we start to develop these habits and these distractions, whether it be something as simple as game playing or something that gets into addiction of substances, there's typically an issue that we're trying to avoid, right? And the distraction is a way of turning our brain off from the thing that we don't want to deal with. And so there's a sacrifice even in that if I stop doing this, I then have to face this.
I have to deal with the things that I don't want to deal with.
Right. And so it does have to be a very conscientious sacrifice. Like, am I willing to go through the hard? I have to get rid of this easy fix, which has become a distraction, a time waster, a life killer, whatever the result is. Am I willing to get rid of this and then go deal with the hard? Because it's a multi-step process.
It is a multi-step process, and the science will say that nature abhors a vacuum too. You can't just stop doing something without replacing it. So you also have to have the sacrifice of doing something differently than you than you want to at the time, or that you are prone to.
So part of the reason why I was really interested in discussing this, as I often use our little, half-hour conversations for self-help, we have been contemplating building a home. And we have a fixed budget. And we have these goals that we want to achieve for living near family, having a certain ability to do things in our home, hosting groups of people, etc. And I've gotten to that point where I don't think we can do both. And now I'm really having to ask that question of myself, what am I willing to sacrifice? And it's not clear cut. And it becomes really, really challenging. And almost, I could see, and I know my proclivity towards wanting to stop the pain of thinking so much and not being able to come up with a acceptable solution. And then therefore going into distraction mode, too much TV, too much time on the phone, etc. It is a vicious cycle sometimes when you're not sure if the sacrifice is going to lead to the desired outcome.
No, that's exactly right. And sometimes you might go down a road where you're trying to make a decision, and you're weighing what am I willing to sacrifice to get this end result long term. And you might, we were contemplating buying a home and doing a fixer-upper, and then maybe try to get it to the point where we could live in it and rent this place out, and maybe it'll all pay for itself and blah, blah, blah. But then I was in a conversation with my dad, and he's like, okay, but look what you're giving up, towards your strategy, your topic of sacrifice. He said, look at the flexibility you're giving up, right? Because you're now in a house and that provides you maximum flexibility. If you then get into this endeavor, it's going to take all your available cash. It's going to take all the flexibility you have. You now have two homes in this place that are sucking up all of your time versus the flexibility you have now to be able to do other things with your time, with your resources, etc. Do you want to give that up?
Well, and sometimes it just takes those curious questions asked to you by someone outside.
That's right.
To bring some clarity.
That's right. And I said thank you to my dad afterwards. It's like, you know what, you asked the right question, which is kind of the purpose of this podcast, is how can we ask those right questions in ways that people will receive them well also. And, and I talk to my dad because he has those great questions, right? Still, and I hope my kids still do that with me sometimes. But that's the point of it is sometimes we go down paths in our own brains where we will make decisions about whether something is the right thing to do. We don't even realize what we're sacrificing until it's pointed out.
Yeah.
Do you understand that you're giving up this to get that?
Yeah. Yeah, and then I guess at some point, if you've got multiple aspects that you're trying to wade through, do you have to do a list of hierarchy in terms of the most important things that you're trying to achieve? Because you may get A, but not B. Maybe C and D are an option, but E's off the table.
And another thing in a multivariable complex problem is my tendency is to kind of let's fix this one, and then let's see what the consequences are to that, and then let's fix this, to try to get to an overall decision. And that sacrifices, there's a sacrifice there in that if I fix this, now I'm making a set of assumptions that that's the right first thing to fix, and then that the other things will flow around that and will be easier to fix based on that. So I have sacrificed some flexibility in even the decision making.
Yeah. And to your point, you don't have guarantee that the outcome is really what you want in the first place. You're just making your best guess.
Your best guess. And that's, I think, one of the things that I constantly think about is process versus outcome. And am I making, sometimes I say, you know what, I don't know what the ultimate outcome is going to be. I think I've got an idea of what I want the outcome to be, but I'm just going to do this for now because I think this is the right next step in the process that'll eventually get me there. It's kind of like the puzzle, right?
Yeah.
It's building the corners and the edges first and trying to get a framework by which then you can build the rest of the stuff.
Yeah, I like that. Well, let's talk a little bit about sacrifice as it pertains to going after a goal. And maybe we're talking about, a job promotion, talking about an advancement in education, something that most people would deem positive, right? So what are some of the negative things that we're willing to sacrifice in order to get to the positive? And then after that, maybe we can transition to the good we're willing to sacrifice to get to the even better.
Right. And now, wisdom is the definition of terms of
Sure.
good and bad sacrifices. But I mean, obviously, if we start with education, a lot of people try to make the decision, is it worth 4 years of my life to go to college and get a degree? Because that sacrifices a lot.
Yes, it
It
does.
sacrifices the ability to go make money now. It sacrifices a Friday night you'd maybe rather would go out with friends. It sacrifices time where you could be spending on hiking or doing other things or going to find yourself or whatever else you wanted to do. You're sacrificing yourself and submitting yourself to a 4-year, 2-year, 6-year process where you're giving over your time and efforts to an institution that's going to confer on you at the end a degree. And then that degree, you're hopefully thinking in your mind, is going to produce better outcomes than if I didn't do this. So there's a lot of assumptions in there.
Oh, huge.
But you're going to sacrifice those 4 years of your life and let other people tell you how to spend them in order to accomplish this degree in this case.
Well, and then I think what makes this choice even more difficult in this day and age is we hear about so many people that get their undergrad degree and then don't even end up working in the field in which they got their degree. And so I'm sure, as a student is, or a potential student is thinking about this process of, am I willing to sacrifice the next 4 years or whatever the time frame is to get this degree, not really knowing the trajectory of their life, not sure, if I get this engineering degree, am I going to be happy in that field? If I get a degree in English, am I going to be employable? These questions that you can't really answer at the beginning of the process. You just kind of have to dive in sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, you can make some educated guesses. You
Sure.
can look at the stats and look at what percentage of English majors have a job within 6 months after graduating college. And those things exist. And
Sure.
if you're willing to look into that, you can certainly make those calculations. But a lot of people will say, well, I'm just following my passions. Well, that's fine, as long as following your passions doesn't have the consequence of putting you into piles of debt that you can never get out from under. As long as following those passions really mean what you think they mean. I'm a big believer in co-ops. I think we've brought this up before, and internships, because the sooner you can find out if you really do enjoy something,
Right.
The better, especially if you're going to make those kinds of investments. And there is attributes to having a degree that are just worth it to have a degree. I haven't designed a circuit in a long time, but my engineering degree has served me well and got me into positions, first at Intel and then other positions where now I'm doing different things. But I wouldn't have gotten here necessarily without that degree,
initial sacrifice.
even though I'm not using that specific degree
Yeah.
on a day-to-day basis. So there's lots of things to think about in that, but the basic crux of what you're saying is it worth this sacrifice to get this outcome?
Right. And then I think about it in the medical realm as well. So I just went to the dentist today. My dental hygienist was talking to me those last couple of appointments that her mother had the same diagnosis I did, a metastasized skin cancer. And we actually have the exact same medical team, which is pretty fascinating to me. But I guess when you don't have a lot of options, you have the same doctors.
Right.
But, I said, hey, how's your mom doing? She goes, well, she was doing good until the last PET scan when something lit up and they decided to do surgery. And I was like, oh no. And then the hygienist said, yeah, but it turned out there was nothing there. The question remains, what caused the lymph system to light up? And so do you sacrifice going through a surgery to maybe not even have a clear outcome? And I just start to think about these choices that we have to make. Am I willing to do a preventative surgery to maybe stave off this situation, And I pray I don't ever have to make the decision about doing immunotherapy. But if I do, am I willing to sacrifice, my relatively good health and feeling well to start a treatment regimen that's going to probably not make me feel very good for the hope of not having further cancer issues down the road? They're tough calls to make.
There are, and what you're bringing up is a whole series of things that are, am I willing to sacrifice this for the potential
Right.
of this.
Yes.
Because we don't know for sure. And, and classic, examples of people who work their whole lives, every day and sacrifice, family and friends and relationships so that they can get to age 65 and retire and buy an RV and run around the country and have the rest of their life fishing and doing absolutely nothing. And classic, where somebody retires at age 65 and they're dead at 67.
Yeah.
Was it worth that entire sacrifice on that plan to get there, and then it goes away because we don't know the outcome?
That's true.
So that person in that line of thinking was saying, I'm going to sacrifice all this for the potential of doing nothing for many years. And that potential may or may not come to fruition.
Yeah.
Like you said, the potential may be a long life afterwards, and maybe it works, but maybe you go through the chemo and, God forbid, you get hit by a bus.
Right.
And so what good did it do, right? How much should you live, this is a whole other philosophical thing, live in the present and for the present moment versus long term. Now, with savings, I always tell my kids, look, put the maximum in to your 401k from your first job, and if there's matching, that makes it even better, because $1 when you're 25 is worth, $1,000 when you're 35, and
Right.
and $1 million when you're 65. But that's really hard to tell someone who's trying to start a family and
Yeah.
buy their first car and their first house. It's like that net present value of money is like, man, I want these things now, and don't I have a responsibility to build my life when I'm young? And I'll make more money later, right? So, is it a sacrifice for a couple of dollars now for savings versus the life I could have now, or not getting into credit card debt?
Right.
Would be the other rationalization there.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can come up with a list of a couple questions, for all of us that are facing that ultimate situation, which I think we all get into probably numerous times a week. Am I willing to sacrifice X for Y? How do we begin to be curious about it in a way that we can ask ourselves some leading questions to ultimately make a decision?
So you said X, Y. So let's say X is the sacrifice and Y is the outcome. I think one of the major decisions right up front we've talked about or questions to ask is, how sure am I that giving up X is going to give me Y?
That's good.
And how sure am I that Y will be the outcome regardless of what I do?
Yeah,
I think is a good first question.
that is a good question.
The second one is, what are the other consequences to myself and those around me of giving up X on the sacrifice side?
Yep.
And then, how willing am I to live without X if I am going to sacrifice it?
Yeah, I think those are some really good key questions. I would love to hear, feedback from any of you that maybe you have your own process for making these decisions. Maybe you didn't think of it in a formula sense, but now, looking back at it, maybe you do have a process that's pretty formulaic. I would love to hear some of your thoughts around that. So please feel free to reach out, leave us a comment on the YouTube page, or if you want to send us a direct email, please do that through our website, which is curiositynotjudgment.com. Any last wrap-up thoughts?
When we're thinking about sacrifice and we're thinking about outcomes, know that there's no direct correlation ever. By definition, you're not going to be able to say, I will sacrifice X and get Y 100% of the time, all the time, the way I think it's going to be.
So me skipping dessert is not necessarily going to amount to my weight loss that I want.
Over time,
Perhaps.
there's a correlation, not necessarily a causation in the way you want.
Ah, okay. We'll leave it there for today. Wish you a great week, and we will catch up again next time right here on Curiosity, Not Judgment. Have a great one.
Until then, take care.